Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today we're tackling a really interesting piece of legislation from the Philippines.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, it is. It's a,
Catchy title.
well, legislation, right? It's also known as the Domestic Administrative Adoption and Alternative Child Care Act.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
It is. It is. But we've got both the act itself and the rules and regulations right here, ready to dig in.
Awesome.
And I think what's so fascinating about this is how it really modernizes the whole adoption system in the Philippines, brings them more in line with international standards for alternative childcare.
Yeah, it's a big shift for them.
So let's start with the basics. Big picture, what's the main goal of this act?
Well, I think the overarching objective is to make sure that every child in the Philippines has a loving and secure permanent home.
Okay.
They really prioritize keeping families together whenever possible.
Right.
But when that's not an option, it establishes a really, really strong system for alternative care.
With adoption being a key part of that.
Exactly. Adoption is a huge focus.
Yeah, it seems like they're really trying to move away from that old institutional model of orphanages and more towards finding families for these kids.
Absolutely. And one thing you'll notice throughout the entire act is this emphasis on the best interest of the child.
I did notice that.
Yeah, it's very much in line with those international conventions and declarations on child welfare.
Makes sense.
Yeah, putting the Philippines right in step with the global best practices.
No, one thing that really jumped out at me was this big emphasis on domestic adoption.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that such a priority, do you think?
It shows a real commitment to preserving a child's cultural identity. I think the lawmakers really want to see these Filipino children raised within their own culture whenever possible.
Yeah.
So intercountry adoption is still an option,
Okay.
but it's definitely treated as a last resort.
Only if they can't find a suitable family within the Philippines.
Right.
Trying to keep those kids connected to their roots.
Exactly. And now this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, lay it on me. They've restructured that Intercountry Adoption Board, the ICAB.
Right, ICB.
They've totally transformed it into this brand new agency. It's called the National Authority for Child Care.
Wow, a whole new agency.
The NACC. Yeah, big change.
What was the thinking behind that?
Well, it shows a real commitment to streamlining the process, to make it much more efficient.
Okay.
The NACC basically becomes this one-stop shop for everything related to alternative childcare.
Oh, wow.
They handle everything. I mean, from declaring a child legally available for adoption to overseeing domestic and intercountry adoptions, foster care,
All of it.
all different forms of alternative care.
Yeah, that's a huge undertaking.
It is, but they're also a quasi-judicial agency.
Okay. And that means?
That means they've got the power to make legally binding decisions.
I see.
So instead of things getting all bogged down in court proceedings, they can move much more quickly.
Much more efficiently.
Exactly.
So they have both the responsibility and the authority to oversee this entire process,
Exactly.
which probably speeds things up considerably.
Yes, absolutely. And, speaking of things that might surprise you, remember when we were looking at the definitions in the Act?
Yeah.
That definition of child really stood out to me.
Oh, yeah, because they actually include adults in that definition.
Yeah. Not what you usually think of, right, when you hear the word child.
Not typically, no.
But in this Act, an adult can be considered a child when it comes to adoption.
So adult adoption is now officially a thing in the Philippines.
It is.
That's a big shift.
It is, and I think it shows a real openness to recognizing that families take lots of different forms.
Yeah.
The Act's acknowledging that those parent-child relationships can develop even without a biological connection.
Right.
And they're providing a way to formalize those bonds.
Interesting. And the fact that this is now an administrative process rather than a judicial one, I imagine that makes it a lot more accessible.
Oh, absolutely. Much easier for people to navigate.
So I'm really starting to see how this act emphasizes these diverse family structures, which is really forward thinking.
Yeah, very much so.
But let's get into the specifics here. Who's actually eligible to adopt under this new law?
Well, first of all, you got to be a Filipino citizen,
Makes sense.
at least 25 years old,
Okay.
clean criminal record, good moral character. Those are pretty standard.
Yeah, I would imagine you'd see that pretty much anywhere.
Yeah, you have to prove that you're emotionally and psychologically ready to be a parent
Of course, yeah.
and that you have the financial means to support a child, right?
Yeah,
They want to make sure these kids are going to homes that can provide for them.
absolutely. Are there any age restrictions?
This is where it gets a little interesting.
Okay.
They have this rule about a 16-year age gap between the adopter and the adoptee.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're 30 years old, you can't adopt anyone older than 14.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
But there are exceptions. Like if you're adopting your own biological child,
Mm-hmm.
or if you're the spouse of the child's parent.
Right, so they're acknowledging that families come in all shapes and sizes,
Yeah.
but they still have some guidelines in place.
Right, and here's another interesting little twist.
Okay, tell me.
The residency requirement for foreign nationals, it can actually be waived under certain circumstances.
Oh, really? Like when?
Like if the adopter is a former Filipino citizen
Hmm?
and they're looking to adopt a relative.
Oh, interesting.
So again, it shows that they recognize that families don't always fit neatly into boxes.
Yeah.
And they're willing to be flexible when it's in the best interest of the child.
So they're being flexible, but within reason.
Yeah.
Now, what about the kids? Who's eligible to be adopted?
Well, any child that's been declared legally available for adoption, obviously. That includes kids who've been abandoned or neglected, or whose parents have voluntarily given up their rights.
Okay.
But it also includes things like stepchild adoptions, adoptions of children born out of wedlock.
So it's a pretty broad range of situations.
Yeah, where a child might need a permanent home. And remember those adult adoptions we talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Act says a Filipino adult can be adopted if they've been, consistently treated as a child by the prospective adopters for at least 3 years before the adoption.
Okay, so we've got a good sense now of who can adopt and be adopted.
Mm-hmm.
Walk me through what happens next. What are those steps involved in this new administrative adoption process?
Well, this is where things get really exciting.
Oh.
We'll dive into all those details of how it works in the next part of our deep dive.
Oh, you've got me hooked. I can't wait.
It's good stuff.
We'll be back soon to explore the next stage of this groundbreaking act. See you then.
See you then.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Republic Act number 11642. Last time we left off talking about who's eligible to adopt under this act.
Right.
Now I'm really curious about how this new administrative adoption process actually works.
Yeah.
Seems like a pretty big change from that old court-based system.
It is. It's designed to be a lot more efficient.
Yeah.
Less intimidating, I think, for everyone involved.
Yeah.
And the goal really is to make adoption faster,
Mm-hmm.
less expensive, and ultimately, more focused on the needs of the child.
Okay, so where does this administrative process actually begin? Who kicks things off?
Well, it all starts at the regional level
Mhm.
with these regional alternative child care offices, the RACOs, as they're called.
Or ICCOs.
They handle all the day-to-day operations for adoptions in each region. Think of them like the local branches of the NECC.
Okay, so they're the boots on the ground, making sure things are running smoothly in their area.
Exactly.
So what's their role in the process?
So the RSCCO, they review the adoption petition.
Mm.
All those supporting documents we talked about, they do interviews
Okay.
with the prospective parents, with the social worker, even the child, if they're old enough.
Wow.
They really want to get a full picture.
So it's a very thorough review process.
Oh, yeah, very thorough. And they only have a limited time to do all of this.
Really?
They have 15 working days to complete that review and make a recommendation.
Wow, that's a tight turnaround. What happens after they finish their review?
Well, if everything looks good, they'll issue what they call a certification of compliance. And then they send their recommendation up the ladder to the Deputy Director for Services at the NACC.
Okay, so there's another layer of review, but this time at the national level.
Right, exactly.
Makes sense. Make
Yeah.
sure everything's consistent across all the different regions.
Yeah, and then that Deputy Director, they get another 15 working days
Mm.
to go over everything, maybe consult with the Child Placement Committee, and then decide whether to approve the petition, or send it back to the RACCO for more information,
Okay.
or pass it along to the Executive Director of the NACC for a final decision.
So it's a multi-step process, but it sounds like they're trying to keep things moving at a decent pace.
Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely checks and balances built in, but the goal is to avoid all those unnecessary delays.
Mm-hmm.
The whole process from start to finish shouldn't take more than 60 calendar days.
Wow, that is incredible. I
Yeah.
mean, that's way faster than going through a typical court process.
No, absolutely. A court process could drag on for months, maybe even years.
Yeah.
And you've got kids stuck in limbo that whole time waiting for a home. So this is a huge improvement.
Yeah, it is a huge improvement. So let's say the deputy director reviews everything and gives it the thumbs up. What happens next?
Then it goes to the Executive Director of the NACC.
Okay.
They also have 15 working days to make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
But they can also send it back to the RACCO if they need more information.
So it's not just a rubber stamp. They're really looking at everything carefully.
Oh, yeah. They really scrutinize these cases to make sure it's the right fit for everyone,
Yeah.
especially the child.
That's reassuring. It's good to know they're not rushing through things just for the sake of efficiency.
Right, definitely not. And remember that pre-adoption placement authority we talked about.
Yeah, yeah.
That comes in here.
Hmm.
If the decision is delayed and it's not the prospective parent's fault, they can actually apply for this placement authority.
Right, so the child can move in with them while they're waiting for the final decision. It sounds like they really have thought of everything to make this process as smooth as possible.
They have. But it's not all about just speed and efficiency. There are also safeguards in place to protect the child's best interests.
Okay, like what?
Well, for example, anyone who has relevant information about the adoption can file a formal objection.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just a one-way street.
No, not at all. If someone has legitimate concerns, they have a way to voice them.
So if someone, say, has evidence that the prospective parents might not be suitable,
Exactly.
or that there's something that, puts the child at risk.
Right. They can bring that to the NACC's attention, and they'll investigate.
So it's a balanced approach. They're trying to be efficient, but not at the expense of the child's safety.
Exactly.
What happens if no one objects and the executive director approves everything?
That's when things get really official.
Okay.
The executive director issues what's called an order of adoption.
And that's the document that makes it all legally binding.
It is, and this is really important. That order of adoption carries the same legal weight as a judicial decree.
Wow.
So it officially recognizes that child as the legitimate child of the adoptive parents, with all the same rights and inheritance privileges.
So no legal distinction between an adopted child and a biological child.
None at all. It's
Yeah.
all about creating a level playing field, making sure those adopted kids are fully integrated into the family.
I'm really impressed by how thorough this whole process is.
Me too. And it doesn't end there. They've put a lot of thought into what happens after the adoption's finalized.
Oh, okay. Like what kind of post-adoption support does the Act provide?
One of the big things is what they call adoption telling.
Adoption telling.
Yeah, it's about helping the parents explain the adoption to the child in a way that makes sense for their age.
Okay.
Actually, the Act requires that the child be told about the adoption before they turn 13.
Which I think is really important. Bringing adoption out in the open helps to remove any stigma, I think. Right.
And allows the child to really understand their own story.
Exactly. And the Act encourages open communication from the very beginning. Even disclosing the adoption to the child as early as possible.
Oh, wow.
Helps build that trust and understanding.
Yeah, it lays the groundwork for some healthy communication patterns down the road. What other kinds of support are offered?
Well, they also acknowledge that, some adopted children, when they get older, might want to learn more about their biological families.
Sure.
So once the adoptee reaches adulthood, they actually have a right to seek help in searching for their biological family.
Wow.
The NACC can help with that, the LGUs, the local government units, or the child placing agency.
So they've got resources to help them with that search.
Yeah.
That's really valuable, especially for someone who might not even know where to begin.
Right, and it's all done very carefully, with sensitivity to everyone's feelings, consent from all parties involved.
Of course, yeah. They emphasize preparing everyone, the adoptee, the adoptive parents, even the biological parents, if possible, for this kind of reunion.
It sounds like they're trying to minimize any potential trauma for everyone involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
They want to make sure that it's handled in a way that's respectful and supportive for everyone.
That's really thoughtful. Are there any other post-adoption services?
Yeah, there's also a provision for ongoing monitoring of that parent-child relationship, even after the adoption is finalized.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How does that work?
It's done through regular visits and reports just to make sure the child is doing well in their new home.
So it's not like a sign the papers and you're done kind of deal.
Yeah.
They're really invested in making sure these adoptions are successful in the long run.
Exactly. They want to catch any potential problems early on, provide support if it's needed.
Okay.
It's a really proactive approach, I think. Shows a real commitment to everyone's well-being.
So we've walked through the entire process now, and it's clear that the Act really emphasizes that permanence of adoption.
Right.
But earlier, you mentioned the possibility of rescission.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is, how it works under this new law?
Of course.
We're back, and, before we wrap up our deep dive on this Act, you mentioned that term rescission of an adoption. Not something you hear every day. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, you're right. It's a good question. Because the Act does emphasize, like we said, how permanent adoption is. But rescission basically means undoing it. Legally undoing the adoption. But here's the thing. Under this act, it can only be started by the adoptee.
Oh, so the child can choose to end it, but the parents can't.
Right, exactly. And I think that really highlights how this act protects the child.
It does. Really puts the child's well-being front and center.
Yeah. I mean, it recognizes that sometimes things just don't work out, even with the best intentions,
Right, right.
and the child needs to have a way out.
Makes sense. But I imagine there have to be some pretty serious reasons for an adoptee to actually go through with ending the adoption, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The act lays out some very specific grounds for rescission.
Like what?
Well, for example, if the parents are repeatedly abusive,
Mm-hmm.
physically or verbally, even if they've gone through, say, counseling and stuff,
Okay.
that could be grounds for rescission. Or if they try to harm the child in any way.
Okay, yeah.
Obviously, that's grounds. And if they just straight up abandon the child or fail to provide basic care,
Right. The
like
essentials.
food, shelter, those sorts of things,
So these are not, just disagreements or personality clashes.
it's going to be pretty major. A real breach of trust or a threat to the child's safety.
Yeah, I see. So how does an adoptee actually go about rescinding an adoption?
Well, they'd have to file a petition with the RACCO in the region where they live.
Okay.
The RACCO then looks into it, investigates the claims, and if they find them to be true, they can issue an order to rescind the adoption.
Okay.
That order then gets registered with the civil registrar, and then the child's original birth certificate, it gets reinstated.
Okay, so there's a whole legal process for unwinding things.
Yes, definitely. It's not just, the kid saying, I don't want this anymore.
Right, there's a procedure. And it sounds like even if the adoption is rescinded, the child's rights are still protected.
Yes, that's right. Any rights that were vested in the child before the rescission, those stay protected.
Okay, so they've really thought of everything. This is a really impressive act.
It is.
We've talked about the eligibility, the new process, even these, complex parts like rescission. Really well thought out.
Yeah, they've done a good job balancing, making things efficient, but also thorough,
Mm-hmm.
and always keeping that focus on protecting the child.
Absolutely. As we've been talking about all this, it's made me wonder, could other countries learn something from what the Philippines is doing here?
That's a great question. I think so. I mean, look, the way they emphasize the rights of the child, that's huge. It lines up with what's happening internationally. And this whole administrative process, it's so much more efficient,
Yeah.
more accessible. I think those are principles that could apply in lots of places.
So it's not just about copying exactly what the Philippines is doing,
Right.
but more about taking inspiration from it.
Exactly. And adapting it to different, cultures and legal systems.
Right, right. And recognizing adult adoption, that's interesting too.
Yeah. That could have implications globally as well.
Because families are changing, right?
They are. All over the world, countries are dealing with these more complex family structures.
Yeah.
And this act really offers a framework for navigating that.
It's almost like they're paving the way for a more inclusive way of looking at families and family law.
I think so.
Yeah.
Setting an example.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. We've explored every corner of this act.
It says.
We've analyzed its approach, even talked about its potential global impact. It's not every day we get to discuss legislation this groundbreaking. I think it's safe to say we've both learned a lot.
I agree.
To our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked some of your own thoughts on these issues. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the topics that matter to you.
Thanks for joining us.